Before superheroes started brooding in rain-soaked alleyways, there was a Batman who cracked jokes, wore a permanent smirk, and treated crime fighting like a formal dinner party with punches. From 1966 to 1968, ABC's Batman turned the Dark Knight into the brightest thing on television, wrapping comic book absurdity in pop art colors and calling it prime time. Adam West played the most sincere Batman ever put on film. Burt Ward bounced around as his eternally excitable sidekick Robin, and a rotating cast of Hollywood legends showed up as villains who all seemed to be in on a joke nobody else had heard yet. This show didn't just bend the rules of superhero storytelling. It threw them out the window along with a few stunt doubles. Today we're diving into 15 strange, surprising, and slightly unbelievable facts about the 1966 Batman series, and we're saving the best one for the very end, because it involves a dance move that was basically invented on the spot. Before we get started, if you're the kind of person who appreciates old-school television chaos, consider sticking around to the finish. Now let's swing into Gotham. When Cesar Romero agreed to play the Joker, he came with a single condition attached to the contract, at least in spirit. His mustache was staying exactly where it was. Romero had built a career as a suave, old Hollywood leading man, and his mustache was practically part of his brand. Shaving it off for a comic book villain simply wasn't on the table, no matter how much grease paint the job required. So the production crew improvised. Instead of asking Romero to part with his facial hair, makeup artists caked thick white face paint directly over the mustache, gambling that the fuzzy picture quality of 1960s television sets would hide the evidence. For a while it worked. On old cathode ray tube screens, the mustache blended into the general fuzziness of the Joker's white face. But time was not kind to the illusion. Once the series was remastered in high definition for DVD and Blu-ray, the disguise fell apart completely. Viewers could suddenly see every single hair poking through the makeup, turning the clown prince of crime into a strange grease-painted uncle who forgot to shave before a costume party. The wildest part is that nobody involved seemed bothered by any of it. There was no reshoot, no fix, no cover-up beyond the original makeup job. In hindsight, it fits perfectly. The Joker is a character built on chaos, mismatched logic, and a total disregard for normal expectations. So a villain who couldn't be bothered to lose the mustache actually feels weirdly true to the character. What would have been a costume department disaster on almost any other show became just another oddball detail baked permanently into Batman lore. Batman's utility belt on this show had nothing to do with tactical realism. It existed purely to make a point. This version of Batman had prepared for absolutely everything, including scenarios that sound suspiciously like they were dreamed up 5 minutes before the cameras started rolling. The belt's most famous contribution to pop culture is the shark-repellent bat spray, deployed in the 1966 feature film to fend off, you guessed it, a shark that had somehow attached itself to Batman's leg mid-flight from a helicopter. It's a gloriously specific solution to a problem nobody could have predicted, and that was exactly the point. But the shark spray was only the headline act. Buried deeper in the belt were gadgets like tiny bat tweezers, an all-purpose bat swatter for dealing with oversized insects, and even something resembling a thermos of bat-branded soup. Because apparently nothing strikes fear into the hearts of criminals, quite like knowing Batman packed a hot lunch just in case. The writers had a simple rule. Nothing counted as a real gadget unless it had bats slapped onto the front of it. A regular tool wasn't funny enough on its own. It needed the branding to sell the joke. Interestingly, this wasn't entirely made up from scratch. The comics had already flirted with shark repellent as far back as the late 1950s, so the show wasn't inventing the concept out of nowhere. It was taking an existing idea and cranking it up until it became absurd. Somewhere along the way, being prepared stopped being a superhero trait and turned into the actual punchline. Batman on this show wasn't reactive. He was aggressively, almost obsessively, ready for a crisis that hadn't happened yet. Long before Adam West ever put on the cowl, producers seriously considered a different actor for the role, Lyle Waggoner. This wasn't a passing thought. Waggoner filmed a full-screen test and came remarkably close to landing the part. On paper, he made total sense. Waggoner was tall, chiseled, and looked like he'd stepped directly out of a comic book panel without needing any adjustments. His take on Bruce Wayne played everything straight. Heroic, sincere, dead serious. And that turned out to be exactly the problem. The scripts themselves were absurd, stuffed with over-the-top dialogue and increasingly ridiculous scenarios, and a Batman who approached that material with total earnestness threatened to make the whole thing feel like an actual straight superhero drama rather than the satire it was meant to be. Producers eventually realized their show didn't need a conventional hero. It needed someone who understood, on some level, that he was standing in the middle of pop art insanity, and who would refuse to acknowledge that fact on camera. That's where Adam West came in. West didn't play Batman as a joke. He played him with total, unwavering conviction, delivering absurd lines with the calm authority of someone explaining tax code. There was no wink to the camera, no self-aware smirk, just pure sincerity applied to ridiculous material, which is exactly what made it funny. The deciding factor, according to Hollywood legend, came from an unlikely source, a Nestle Quik commercial. Producer William Dozier reportedly saw West playing a spy character in a spoof ad and immediately recognized the specific skill set the show needed, someone who could parody serious genres without ever breaking character. As for Wagoner, missing out on Batman didn't derail his career. He went on to spend years as a fixture on The Carol Burnett Show, building a strong reputation in sketch comedy. And in a fitting twist, he did eventually end up in the DC universe after all, just not in Gotham. Wagoner later played Steve Trevor on Wonder Woman. The Batmobile wasn't built from scratch as a purpose-made superhero vehicle. It began its life as the Lincoln Futura, an experimental 1955 concept car that Ford had essentially abandoned, a stylish, expensive prototype nobody had a use for anymore. Custom car builder George Barris purchased the Futura for $1, and that's when the real challenge began. Barris originally hoped to design and build a Batmobile completely from the ground up, but the studio handed him a brutal timeline: 3 weeks to deliver a fully realized superhero car for a television show that hadn't even premiered yet. Starting from nothing simply wasn't realistic on that schedule. So Barris looked at what he already had, the Futura's dramatic tail fins and its bubble-shaped canopy, and decided to lean into the car's inherent weirdness rather than fight it. What emerged from that frantic 3-week sprint became one of the most recognizable vehicles in television history. Glossy black paint, bold red trim, and bat motifs worked into nearly every surface. For all its visual drama, the Batmobile wasn't actually fast. Its heavy steel body, tendency to overheat, and habit of blowing tires kept its real-world top speed to a modest 45 miles per hour or so. Most of the high-speed chase sequences audiences remember were the product of clever editing, camera angles, and Adam West doing his best to look like he was hurtling through Gotham at breakneck speed. None of that mattered to viewers, though. The Batmobile didn't need to be quick. It needed presence, and it had presence in abundance. It became just as iconic as the Batsuit itself, all thanks to a scrap concept car and a producer with an impossible deadline. On this show, good and evil weren't only communicated through dialogue or costume choices. They were built directly into the camera work. Whenever the picture suddenly tilted at an exaggerated angle, as though the cinematographer had one too many drinks, audiences instantly knew what that meant. A villain's lair was on screen. These tilted compositions, known in film terminology as Dutch angles, weren't a subtle stylistic flourish. They functioned almost like a visual punchline, hammering home a fairly blunt metaphor. Crooked people get a crooked frame. The show wasn't shy about the joke, either. The rules stayed remarkably consistent throughout the series. Wayne Manor was always shot perfectly level. Gotham City Police Headquarters stood as straight and orderly as the officers inside it. But the instant the story cut to a villain's hideout, usually stuffed with oversized props, color-coordinated henchmen, and a mastermind dressed head to toe in a themed costume, the camera would lean so dramatically it practically needed its own support beam. The tilts weren't random, either. Several recurring villains were given their own signature degree of camera lean, subtly tied to their particular brand of madness, so that even the geometry of a scene carried a bit of characterization. There was also a sly nod to the source material buried in this technique. Those slanted frames echoed the dynamic, off-kilter panel layouts common in comic book art, effectively turning every villain scene into something resembling a living, moving splash page. It was stylish, it was ridiculous, and it was exactly the kind of visual joke that defined the show's entire sense of humor. Burt Ward, who played Robin, ended up doing an enormous amount of his own stunt work. Falls, fights, explosions, you name it. Adam West had a professional stuntman, Hubie Kearns, handling the riskier physical sequences for Batman. Robin, on the other hand, mostly got Ward himself. According to Ward's later recollections, the arrangement caused him real physical damage almost immediately. He has said that during his very first week filming the series, he ended up in the emergency room on 4 separate occasions. In the pilot episode alone, a sharp turn during a Batmobile scene sent a door swinging open and launched Ward directly onto the pavement, essentially turning him into an unpaid crash test subject before the show had even properly begun. The flashy turbine exhaust effects that made the Batmobile look so futuristic were also entirely real. Sparks, heat, and all. And they reportedly scorched both Ward's cape and his skin on more than one occasion. During one particular stunt, Ward was supposed to crash safely through a breakaway prop sign designed to shatter on impact. The sign, unfortunately, did not break as planned. Ward, unfortunately, did, walking away from that take with chipped teeth and bruised ribs. Through all of it, production simply continued on schedule. Ward later joked, with the benefit of hindsight, that it sometimes felt like the studio was quietly testing how much punishment he could absorb before the season wrapped. Knowing that history adds a strange new layer to every enthusiastic holy something or other. The characters shouted on screen. Robin's boyish enthusiasm came with a genuine cost behind the scenes. Actor Frank Gorshin turned the Riddler into one of the show's most memorable villains, twitchy, manic, and cackling like a man who'd had far too much coffee, and then discovered a life of crime as an outlet. His performance made the character a fan favorite almost instantly, and became one of the biggest draws, pulling audiences back week after week. Naturally, after the success of the first season, Gorshin's representatives approached the studio asking for a significant pay increase, reportedly requesting something in the range of a jump from around $3,500 to $5,000 per appearance. The producers declined. Rather than meeting the request, the show attempted a workaround. They took a script originally written for the Riddler and hastily reworked it to introduce a brand new villain called the Puzzler, played by Maurice Evans. The concept, the riddles, and the general energy were nearly identical. Only the name and the actor had changed. Audiences were not fooled for a second. Ratings dipped noticeably, and fan complaints piled up. The substitute villain simply didn't land, proving that you can copy a gimmick, but not necessarily the specific charisma that made it work in the first place. Actor John Astin also briefly stepped into the Riddler role for a 2-part story during Gorshin's absence, but the character still felt like it was missing something essential. Eventually, the studio and Gorshin worked out their differences, and he returned for a final appearance in the show's 3rd season, in an episode that served as something of a victory lap and a quiet peace offering to fans. The entire episode underscored a simple truth the producers had clearly learned the hard way. You can rewrite a script and rename a villain, but you can't replace a specific performer's manic energy with budget math. Before Batman ever reached television screens, it tested so poorly with early audiences that ABC executives reportedly panicked behind closed doors. Test viewers were handed dials to register their reactions in real time as they watched. Control footage, reportedly a Mr. Magoo cartoon, produced consistently positive responses. Then the Batman pilot began, and viewer engagement dropped sharply. Audiences seemed genuinely confused by the show's tone, unsure whether they were watching a serious adventure series or something else entirely. The pilot reportedly scored in the upper 40s on a scale where successful shows typically needed to land in the mid-60s, putting it among some of the lowest test scores in the network's history at that point. Executives were reportedly convinced they had an expensive embarrassment on their hands. Under normal circumstances, that kind of reaction might have quietly killed a project before it ever aired. But Batman had already become too costly to abandon. ABC had invested heavily in sets, costumes, and promotional campaigns, and canceling the show outright would have meant absorbing the entire loss with nothing to show for it. So the network moved forward anyway, airing the series and hoping for the best. When the show finally premiered in January of 1966, everything changed almost overnight. Once audiences saw the series presented with the right context and promotional framing, clearly signaling that the show was intentionally over the top, it became a sensation. More than half of American television households reportedly tuned in during its early run, an extraordinary audience share for the era. Batman didn't survive because network executives believed in its potential from the start. It survived because it had already become too expensive, too heavily promoted, and too far along in production to quietly cancel. Sometimes that's simply how a piece of television history gets made. By 1967, Batman had begun losing steam, and ABC was growing visibly nervous. The show hadn't lost its color or its energy, but the cultural momentum that once brought the country to a standstill each week was clearly fading. The network delivered a blunt message to producers: change something meaningful or prepare for cancellation. Their solution was a familiar television playbook: introduce a new character. Enter Yvonne Craig as Batgirl, brought into the series during its third season as Barbara Gordon's secret crime-fighting identity. The character was specifically designed to attract younger female viewers and address growing criticism that the show felt like an exclusive boys' club built entirely around gadgets and male camaraderie. Batgirl was written as intelligent, capable, and independently heroic, explicitly framed as a positive role model rather than a sidekick or a love interest. To convince network executives the idea could actually work, producers reportedly put together a special short presentation specifically to demonstrate how Batgirl could function alongside Batman and Robin without disrupting the show's existing dynamic. The pitch succeeded, earning the series a fourth-season renewal. But television has a way of producing unexpected outcomes. While the character was designed to draw in young girls, Batgirl's striking purple costume, her dramatic motorcycle entrances, and Craig's natural athleticism — she had trained as a ballet dancer before her acting career — ended up having a very different effect on the broader audience. Male viewership actually increased noticeably following her introduction. The network, perhaps sensing an unplanned but welcome outcome, largely stopped asking too many questions about exactly why the strategy was working. Batgirl didn't manage to save the series indefinitely, but her addition proved an interesting point. Sometimes a creative fix succeeds, just not necessarily for the reasons anyone originally intended. The instantly recognizable onomatopoeia graphics that exploded across the screen during every fight scene, words like POW and Zap splashed in bold, jagged lettering, weren't just a fun visual gimmick thrown together carelessly. The production reportedly used more than 80 unique graphic variations throughout the series, mixing reliable favorites with strange one-off words designed purely to keep things visually unpredictable. There was also a very practical reason behind the technique. Network standards teams were concerned that the fight choreography, however cartoonish, might read as too intense for younger viewers. Rather than trimming the action itself, the production covered the punches and kicks with bright comic book-style sound effect graphics, effectively transforming violence into a stylized visual joke. A punch stopped being a punch and instead became a burst of colorful typography, essentially